Welcome to the Enviro Pet Waste Network webinar, How to Backyard Pet Waste Composting. EPWN is a nonprofit organization connecting people to the information supporting pet waste disposal methods that are kinder to the planet. For more information, visit epwn.org. Hi, I'm Jennifer Pope. I'm the VP of Marketing for BioBag Americas, a proud EPWN sponsor. I've been with BioBag for the past 15 years, and while our main mission is landfill diversion of common organics like food scraps and yard waste, we are very passionate about working with partners and developing composting and alternatives for often overlooked materials like pet waste, diapers, and animal mortality. I'll be introducing our speaker today, Rick Carr, who manages farm operations at Rodale Institute in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. We have 82 signups from organizations, businesses, and pet parents around the world. Rick Carr earned a Master's of Science degree in plant pathology from Cornell University, where he conducted research that contributed to the understanding of biologically based disease suppression. While pursuing a research and training opportunity on a large certified organic farm in Argentina, he developed a new perspective on how laboratory studies translate to on-farm research and application. Rick has been studying the science and utilization of compost, vermicompost, and liquid compost extracts. As compost production specialist, Rick managed Rodale's Institute large-scale composting facility and oversaw field application of compost in several projects. His most recent project was examining manure and pasture management strategies that reduce swine parasites in pastured pork production. He is now the senior farm director and manages all farming operations across Rodale's Institute 10 campuses. Rick is here today to help us understand the basics of composting household pet waste and answer all your questions about the process.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Rose, for inviting me to present on this topic. I'm sure the bench is pretty thin on people who are as excited about talking about poop as I am. Lastly, thanks for everyone that's joining on this presentation. As you could tell by my background, composting is a passion of mine. I've been working in this field in just about every capacity, from backyard composting to large scale vermicomposting. It's my daughter handing the former, you can see my cursor, former governor of Pennsylvania, Tom Wolf, handing him a worm from the worm bin. I've worked with lots of municipalities. Again, my daughter, you're going to see my kids in these pictures a bunch. We're at City of Allentown's yard waste processing facility. And as Jennifer mentioned, I have a degree in using compost to suppress plant pathogens. Over the last month, well, let me mention, put in this plug because this presentation isn't that long and I could talk about composting for hours. But I prepared a few years ago, 7-part series on backyard composting. So a lot of how-tos, whys, and what can be composted. Check those out if you want more information. That's on Rodale Institute's YouTube channel. Over the last month, I've been traveling across the country, giving compost presentations from Pennsylvania all the way out to Washington State. And during the presentations, I usually go through the general information, the usual stuff, and I ask people what can be composted. And then I quickly stop and say, it's better just to say what can't be composted. And we're just focusing typical household items. These are the most common: the glass, metal, plastic, and styrofoam. Of course, they can't be composted. Everybody pretty much knows that. But when I ask that question, I get a lot of odd answers. But the usual ones that I get are meats, dairies, fats, oilies, and fermented items. And, of course, I get pet waste. That comes up as well. And I've been doing this for almost 20 years. and composting it at all of these things, these items at every level, mortality composting. And I just want to say it's wrong. I mean, if nature can break this stuff down, so can you. I don't know why people say I don't have a straight uh, answer for that. But I think one of the reasons, and I will agree with it, if you're not familiar with composting, the composting process, how to do it, these are items that can get you into trouble. They could bring flies, you could introduce pathogens, odors, um, pests, furry and otherwise, and also angry neighbors if you're doing things wrong. But in any typical backyard composting system, all of these are easily compostable. And so let's just clarify one thing for this group here. Pet waste, it is just manure. The waste, as if you think a big picture here, the the waste that's coming from all these animals here is no different. It might be treated just a little bit differently because of its moisture content or the characteristics of it. But you know, cattle manure, dairy manure, that's common application in fields, raw or composted. Same with bird manure, from chicken operations. And I don't know why, just because it's our pets, that you would think that you can't compost pet waste because it is just manure. Now, the concerns about it that people tell me are, yeah, of course, pathogens. Sometimes I hear medications. I won't going to mention too much about medications, but those items break down either in the body or they break down over time. That's why there's an expiration date on your medicines. So they're not a concern during the composting process. And the bacterial enzymes that are produced or that are living in a compost pile, they easily break down those molecules in medications. The pathogens, yeah, that there are concerns about pathogens in any waste, and so all feces contain fecal coliforms. And if you're not unfamiliar with that, fecal coliforms are bacteria, and there's some that are produced in feces or that are living in feces, some that aren't. So this little image on the left shows total coliform, and then we get specific to the fecal coliform. E. coli is a subgroup of those. E. coli is in your body now. It's a native inhabitant in pretty much all soils, but there are pathogenic E. coli, so different strains of E. coli. And those ones, if you get it in the wrong place, they cause gastral distress, projectile vomiting, and explosive diarrhea. And it's 99% of people have experienced something like that in their lifetime. And it's not pleasant. And so you want to avoid that at all costs. But avoiding. So how can we avoid it? I like to, this is like the big picture of composting pet waste. And the aversion to it is I like to describe understanding risk of exposure to the pathogens. And so what that means, and I'll give an analogy, risk of exposure to, say, lead or arsenic. Where's the greatest risk of exposure? Old buildings with lead paint. So new buildings, they're not going to have lead paint. Most cities, they have brownfields in them where they're contaminated with some heavy metal, like from decades of leaded gasoline. That stuff is there. But the risk of exposure is when it's the location it's in is disrupted. Lead doesn't easily get into water. It's bound up in soil. So drinking water, it's a low risk of exposure until some of the water conditions change, like pH. But bringing it back to risk of exposure of pathogens in pet waste. I'm going to show a series of images here and describe what the risk of exposure might look like. So you have a dog outside defecating. They do that all the time. Risk of exposure there is you stepping in it, bringing it inside, or getting on your shoe, and then touches your hand, and then you end up touching your mouth or eating or something like that. That's the risk of exposure. That pet defecating out there is a very low risk of exposure. Or you walking in with your bare feet. That's another one, like kids running around. I'll show a slide later, but I'll mention it here that these fecal coliforms that contain pathogens, human pathogens, they don't survive too well outside. And there's going to be a great slide at the very end here. Risk of exposure. A dog wiping its butt on your carpet, and then you're laying around walking on that carpet. So whatever fecal coliforms are there, you have a greater risk of exposure to getting on your hand, touching it on your face or mouth, and then it's getting into your digestive tract. Here's the greatest risk of exposure. Dog licking its butt and then licking your face. We love dogs, and that's a normal thing, but that's the greatest risk of exposure. On the counterpoint, if we put that pet waste into a compost pile where there's intense microbial activity, give it time and temperature to break down, and then we try to process that there, it's a very low risk of exposure. It's there, but if you don't know what you're doing, yeah, there is a risk. But even the processed material here, handling the processed composted material that's fully composted and cured, it's a very, very low risk, almost undetectable, and in many cases undetectable. I've never read a report where they've been able to detect E. coli in cured compost. But we're taking that compost and we're spreading it and diluting it into our gardens or wherever that is, into the landscape. And the risk of exposure there is when you're actually digging it up, and like my daughter's digging up potatoes and carrots. Otherwise, there's no real risk of exposure in there. The greater risk of exposure in your garden is the bird poop that might land on your tomatoes. All right, so how can we do this correctly? I encourage you to look at some of my videos in that 7-part series. I'm only going to show this one slide to describe the easiest way to reduce risk of exposure, compost effectively in your backyard. So these are just normal backyard composting systems. And we're doing a technique that I always encourage people to do for many reasons, is to lasagna layer. So what that looks like, if we cross-section a compost pile, just like this pile here on the pallet, you take your greens, that's going to be your nitrogenous material like manures, and you layer that with a brown layer, and you keep the greens in the center of the pile. There's many reasons why you do that, to avoid all the problems that I mentioned previously about pests. You keep that contained in the middle of the pile. You reduce odors, but you're also putting those sensitive materials or that highly compostable materials, you're putting them in a concentrated location where they're more likely to break down quicker or heat up. And so what your pile should look like is just a pile of leaves. There's leaves and straw in this one, and nobody has a clue what's inside of it. There's some nasty stuff in this pile. I know I put it in there, but nobody has a clue what's in there. And getting back to the justification of why you can compost all these materials, including pet waste. So this is just a simple sketch of what a compost pile looks like over time. This is your classic time temperature graph, but it's also showing the organisms that are active during that time period. So bacteria are active at all stages of composting. This solid line here is your time and temperature. Not all backyard compost piles are going to heat up. Probably, I consider myself an expert in backyard composting, and only during the summer will I measure temperatures above 130 degrees. But that's what it looks like. So all those microbes that are in there breaking things down, the small amount of E. coli that's introduced through pet waste is competing for the same resources. And it just gets out-competed for a number of reasons. This is a human manure handbook by Joseph Jenkins. And he has a figure in here. It's referencing this one source, this research paper. and showing that over time and temperature, they're going to play a role in destroying pathogens. So if you have a lower temperature, which this is simply saying is if you have a lower temperature pile, you're going to need more time to destroy those pathogens. Another one, I mentioned the survival of fecal coliforms in soil. This is showing how many days they can survive in the summer versus how many days in the winter. And again, that's just you give it more time. Temperature plays a role in this. And they're saying after, what was it, 15 days? About 15 days, you get 99% of fecal coliforms destroyed. One last slide, and then I'll take questions. The composting handbook, the Bible for composting at pretty much any level, written by Robert Rink and others. They have this slide here, and this is just a table. I'm not going to go through this. That it's just showing all these human pathogens in this table, and there's more than one of these tables, and I've read several of these when it comes to plant pathogens and human pathogens. So that this is all research, peer-reviewed research papers showing the destruction of pathogens, plant or human, during the composting period. And so if anybody has, I mean, I think my slides will be shared, but you could go back to these original articles or just read this table alone. And so with that, I'll take questions.
Can I ask you a question?
Go for it.
So how do you feel about composting when you like dig a hole and put it in a trash can with a bunch of holes in the bottom and just keep it in the ground? Is that because everything you're showing is above ground at this point? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, that I have heard of people doing that, and that's acceptable. I think it's more difficult to manage a pile like that because it's below ground. And so that might be a situation which we often call dump and run. And so it's not managed. You're just throwing those materials into it, and you got to give it a lot more time.
Yeah, I've heard that the one person said you got to worry about the coli getting into the water stream, but if you don't have a water table that's real high, I guess it's not an issue.
E. coli won't, if you get flooding conditions, they don't really move in soil unless
Okay.
it's flooded conditions. And E. coli are only going to survive at the top layers of soil.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
I have
Mary?
a question. Yeah, I wanted to know, like, what do you do with the bags, dog waste bags that are mixed in with pet waste?
That's one thing that I've been trying to work on a good answer. I mean, if they're not compostable bags,
Yeah.
like the bio bags that Jennifer works for, if they're not compostable, then you got to dump that into your compost pile and then throw those bags away.
Okay.
Trash those bags.
Do you mind if I take another question?
Yeah.
Okay. So, when you do a compost for a backyard, how do you calculate? Is there like a ratio of the wet waste, the pet waste versus the brown waste? How do you do it in like kind of a bolus, or do you just do continuous or intermittent, I guess is what I'm saying, processing?
Well, I think I understand your question, and so I'm going to give you a couple responses to it. Pets, like humans, either in the kitchen or in the bathroom, we generate waste every day. And so storing that waste, it could be problematic. And, a lot of people might not want to do that. So you're constantly adding to a compost pile. And as far as the ratio or the mix that you would do, I would, if it was my pile, I would add the pet waste directly to the compost and not try to store it with my food waste that I generate, which I do store in 5-gallon buckets until I'm ready to do that lasagna layering, and refill the bucket. I just keep repeating that. I would add it right onto the top of the pile, my compost pile, right into the leaves that are there. You could bury it simply with a pitchfork and just so that you don't see it. But the general rule of thumb with your green waste to brown waste, your browns being your leaves or straw or something like that, dry, brittle, carbon material. General rule of thumb is if you have a bucket of greens, you're going to need to balance that with about 3 to 5 buckets of brown material. And most of that is depending on the conditions of the green. So if you have a 5 gallon bucket of rotting tomatoes, lots of water, you'll definitely need a higher end of brown material to balance that moisture.
Thank you.
Got another question if I could?
Please.
So if the dog poop is dried out, does that cause the E. coli to be lower, or does it just, whether it's wet or, been there for 2 weeks and it's all dried?
Yes, it does. E. coli is not good at surviving in the soil. There's other bacteria that are better at surviving over winter, long periods. So if it's drying out, it requires bacteria. All life requires water. So in that scenario, you have a much higher reduction of fecal coliforms.
Okay, and from what I understand, that's kind of there's other things to test for, but I've been told that if you test for that and it's low, chances are the other bad stuff is low also, or is that
That's
true?
usually the case. I've only read a small handful of reports that do the whole gamut of fecal coliforms and human pathogens. But E. coli seems to be the simplest one to test for and the cheapest.
One more question, I guess.
Please keep going.
Yeah. So if you don't get the temperature, will time work? I mean, like, if you keep it in, what I do is like I said, I do it in the ground, but I do turn it, and I've let it sit for 6, 7 months, and because I have like 4 or 5 buckets, or not buckets, but trash cans, and I rotate them, and when it goes through the winter and you pull it out, there's worms everywhere, and it doesn't look anything like dog poop. It looks perfect, but I know it's not getting temperature, but it's a lot of time and worms and breakdown, and I would assume that's doing the same thing.
That is absolutely doing the same thing. I didn't show I didn't mention anything about that, but I've read many studies. I do a lot of worm composting. Read many studies of destruction of E. coli in vermicompost, and that never reaches any temperatures above. I mean, you want that room temperature. And so, yes, it's just time and microbial activity.
Perfect. Thank you.
Another question.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I am very interested in composting compostable cat litter, which is made from either paper or, it could be made from plant material. But I wanted to know if you separated out the cat feces from the dog feces, or with the dog feces rather, and then had the cat litter, that would be counted as the brown, correct? If it was compostable.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Just repeat like the back end. I was reading a quick comment, and I'll mention that I can't see everybody and hands raised, so just go ahead and speak up after somebody's finished. But you are
Suggesting that
the compostable cat waste or compostable cat litter. What do you treat that as? A brown or green?
Yeah.
That depends on the material. Is it before the cat got to it? Definitely a brown. And if it all depends on how much feces are in there. And I would say on the safe side, 50-50. Treat it as like a 50-50 mix.
Okay. And I'm a little concerned about how frequently you monitor the compost for pathogens. Do you have a regular monitoring schedule that you use, and who do you use to test it? Do you have an individual private lab, or do you have a relationship with a educational institution, or what?
If I was going to test, I would use a third-party lab for sure, accredited lab, and yeah, I could name off one that's here in Pennsylvania, but every state has several of them. But to be honest, I've never tested for human pathogens. I've read so many reports that that's enough information for me to justify not testing. I know that after all those research papers that I pulled up that was in the that book of composting, I've read most of those reports in my time, and it's just enough for me to know that E. coli, pathogenic E. coli, just can't survive in a compost pile if it goes cured, if it's cured. And I mean, I've read mortality composting that's equally dangerous, where you're taking dead animals, dead farm animals, and you compost them. You do it right, everything breaks down. You might be left with some dry bones, but otherwise, and I do that in my backyard too. I hunt, and so I try to fill my freezer with deer meat. And the 1 year, and I'm starting to do this every year now. The skulls I save, I compost them. It took 19 days for all the skin to fall off. That's how quick it, and that was a very active compost pile. And then after that, I pulled it so I could bleach it and save it. But I had a first year, first winter I was working at Rodale, unfortunate things, animals die. And what do you do with them? The normal thing to do for farmers is you drag them to the corner of your property where nobody can see and just leave them go, maybe cover it. But the EPA has considered that a point source of pollution. So you got to do something better. Composting, the U.S. Composting Council and Cornell Waste Management Institute, they came up with the idea and in the method for mortality composting. And so it's a pretty detailed method, but it works. And I tried that for the first time in 2013, and I was a 600-pound sow pig, and it's gone. I mean, it took months, but it was gone, like 5 months. And that's the same, and that animal is going to have way more human pathogens in it than pet waste.
Do you think that,
Rick,
I'm sorry, do you think that health agencies and municipalities discourage pet waste composting just because they think people aren't going to do it right? And there are pathogens in there that are not necessarily in their chicken waste, for do-it-yourself composting. I know industrial facilities, there's no problem. The compostable bags break down. They do it all over Canada, with green bin composting. But this do-it-yourself, do you think they worry that people just will get sick because they don't do it properly?
I think it's two things, and I can't confirm because I never want to argue with somebody that makes that statement. But they're concerned about the pathogens for sure. And yes, I think you might not be doing it right, but that comes down to if they're making those recommendations, it's a lack of knowledge. I think they're taking the safe route because they're responsible for making these. It's policy. So if they make a policy and somebody gets sick on doing their policy, then somebody could be liable, point the finger or whatever.
Rick, I've got a question. If someone's quite new to composting, what's your best tip for them in terms of what you've learnt?
It's okay to make mistakes. So I've made all the mistakes in composting. Sometimes I'm making them intentionally just to confirm what I already know. But that's usually the thing is when I give presentations, I ask people, their background in composting. Some say they've tried. I say, well, what happened? And they give me, some troubleshooting thing. It's like, yeah, I've experienced enough. I would have detected that beforehand. But they give up. So it's okay to make mistakes. Also, I tell them there's a lot of information. You Google composting, and you don't have to take my word on it, or my methods. I don't have a precise method. My rule number one in backyard composting is there's no one right way to do it. And so I start all my backyard compost workshops with that rule. and everybody could be doing a little different. We're achieving the same goal. So I'm not going to be one to say, do it this way. But there's a lot of information on the web that you can start doing it, talk to people who are doing it. Yeah, and it's okay to make mistakes.
Thanks.
Rick, I had a question. If someone's new to pet waste composting, but they're already doing food waste composting, would you suggest adding it to their current food waste, yard waste pile, or do a separate pile for starting the pet waste?
I would add it to the same pile. If they're doing food waste, there's, yeah, maybe a 40-20% chance they're doing meats as well, and some of the no-nos. If they're seasoned composter, don't create a whole nother system. It's all going to get broken down the same way. And yeah, you're not going to have a large bin for just your pet waste. It's just a small volume, but people generate a lot of food waste.
Mhm.
And I will say that I told you there's no one right way to do it. I get a similar question very often about weeds. How do we handle weeds? I say, yeah, you could have a separate pile. You could put them wherever you want. You could do the same thing with pet waste. It just requires you're doing two jobs, so it's more work. That's all. But hey, if it makes you feel better, I would say go ahead and do that. I'd rather see you do two piles than throw it in the landfill.
Question, Rick?
Go ahead.
So it sounds like you use it in your vegetable garden when you're all done.
Sure.
Okay. I'd be a little more conservative. I would just stick it under my fruit trees. But if you're confident in what you're doing, I assume it's not a problem.
I'm 100% confident. The EPA and the National Organic Program have the same rules on composting pet waste or manure. You could apply raw manure in organic certified farms. You could apply raw manure onto vegetable gardens. There's a certain time window before harvest. And I could go through, it's 90 days or 120 days, depending on what you're growing. So it is allowable, and EPA has similar rules, but the National Organic Programs regulated by the USDA, and they're the strictest, and so it is allowed. I compost it, and I could use it unrestricted. I follow their time and temperature rules.
Rick, I've got a question about local government. So, what sort of message would you have for staff in local government who are wanting to help their residents to start composting? It's something that I know Australians are quite interested in.
That's a tough one.
Okay.
Let me try to think of a response. It's just providing the education. That's where I would start. Providing the workshops. I think if you get to a policy level, it's and I've never really seen policy levels. I know some HOAs, what's the HOA stand for? Where the neighborhood is restricted, and they would say no composting allowed at that level, and you buy into an HOA, so you have no choice. But otherwise, I've never seen a municipality here on the East Coast say you can't compost. But I've been at that level where I became a master composter in 2008, and that was funded through the local community, local municipality.
Ah, right.
Yeah. They want people to do it, but they need the educators, the army of educators. Master composter is similar to master gardener, if you know what that is. So it's education-based volunteering, and they send them out, and their whole thing is outreach and education. Let's do it
Thank
right.
you.
We're all going to do it.
I have another question. Okay, so I've been reading a lot of the research literature on parasites. And in cat waste, we have a real problem with Toxoplasma gondii. And because it's a protozoa and it forms spores that can last in the environment for years, and there's very few things that will inactivate the spore. And cats are the only, like, it has 4 different stages of development in different warm-blooded animals, humans, birds, dogs, whatever. But the main problem is that the reproductive spores are hosted by cats. So this is a contaminant of concern for the EPA, and it has made its way into the marine environment. So they found it in mussels, and it was killing sea otters in San Diego. And basically, it's not inactivated by UV light, by chlorine, by many things, except high heat of 140 degrees for 3 to 5 days. So my question is, in Pennsylvania, when we have winter, would there be a cutoff date that you would not, if you're sure that you're reaching 130 degrees because you're checking the temperature on your pile in the summer, and it's reached 140 degrees, and it's been stable for 3 to 5 days, what happens then when the temperature drops and you can't compost? You can't get that temperature.
That's a very good question, and I'm familiar with that parasite. And I'll say that my recent familiarity with that is that I work with pigs, and they have parasites as well, worms that develop resting spores, is what you're describing there.
Right. Pigs are
Thick-walled resting spores. These spores survive in the environment for, there's a couple of reports, 7 to 10 years.
right.
They survive in the soil for that long. Now, what the difference between surviving in the soil or in the environment compared to a compost pile is that there's greater amount of microbial activity. And these microbes are producing enzymes, are producing toxins. So that's one part of it. That, I mean, the ag industry has found that these microbes in compost piles, we could take advantage of them because of the toxins they produce. So there's a lot of biocontrol agents that you could find in compost. BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, BT corn, Roundup Ready corn, that comes from a bacteria. So most of the bacilli, these bacteria, they produce these toxins naturally, and they can destroy some of these thick-walled structures. Temperature is the other one that is on your side. And so if it's not meeting temperatures, I agree, in my compost pile gets close to freezing solid in the winter. And I'm adding to it all winter long, as I generate my food waste. So yeah, it's composting, but it's cold composting, and you're not getting that intense microbial activity. I also give my backyard, I didn't mention this, and I don't think my videos go into this level of detail, but in my backyard compost piles, they go through a 2-year process. Now, I don't know the specifics on those structures. Not every thick-walled spore structure is the same. I don't know how long they survive just under natural conditions in the environment. I've only read it for various other organisms. And so I would look into that. Even still, if it's doing everything you say, that cat's still defecating in those things. I'm going to return to the risk of exposure. You're putting it through a ringer of intense conditions if you're going to compost it. And then when you're finished, you're diluting that into the environment at a greater level, where it's still your risk of exposure is going down and down. And when I encourage in my compost talks, when you're using it, to incorporate it into the soil as much as possible. You want to get it close to the plant roots. So it's not really on the surface. So if you're doing tomatoes, you shouldn't get any splash. But UV radiation does destroy some of these structures. So even if it was on the surface, there might be a chance that it get destroyed that way.
Could you give us the name of the independent lab from Pennsylvania?
MJ Ryder, Reider. They do our water testing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And if you have, yeah, I don't know what state you're in, but you certainly have something closer. But we use MJ Ryder. It's 20 minutes away, 30 minutes away.
Okay.
Great questions.
Yeah.
That was, Mary, that was the most specific. You sound very knowledgeable on that particular topic. That's where I kind of geek out.
Okay. Anybody else? Lingering questions? Okay. Well, thank you, Rick, for the presentation, and thank you, everyone, for your great questions and the continued discussion. I'm sure this will be helpful information for anyone that signed up and listens to the webinar later on. You'll receive all these recordings after the webinar. And good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. EPWN will keep you up to date on all the current upcoming webinars, and we hope that you'll join us.
Thank you.